From the abyss of the unknown, they suddenly emerged, bringing plunder and death, extending their relentless path from the rugged shores of Scotland to the distant reaches of the Caspian Sea. For centuries, their deeds were shrouded in a fog of myth and fear. But now, thanks to the revolutionary advancements in modern archaeology and cutting-edge science, the true driving forces behind the legendary Viking raids, from the boundless Russian plains to the icy expanses of the North Atlantic, are beginning to be revealed. While modern enthusiasts of Scandinavian culture strive to recreate the lives of ancient warriors by participating in staged battles at festivals like Valhalla, scholars and archaeologists from all corners of Europe are making truly groundbreaking discoveries. Recent research casts the Vikings in an entirely new light, placing them within the brutal social context of their era and highlighting their astonishing capacity for strategic planning and lightning-fast execution of expeditions aimed at achieving maximum profit and staggering psychological effect. When the Vikings descended upon the lands, there was famine in England, and dragons seemed to soar in the sky. Their arrival was perceived as part of a divine punishment, ancient chronicles attest. Discovered remains speak for themselves. They were thrown to the bottom of the ditch and suffered very serious injuries. The bodies were severely mutilated. Legs and arms were missing. The second vertebra clearly indicates traces of decapitation. As can be seen, there is a clear cut through the cervical spine. This captivating story of the Vikings takes us to the picturesque island of Saaremaa, located in Estonia. It was here, during painstaking excavations, that a team of archaeologists from Tallinn unearthed a truly astonishing hoard of Viking artifacts. A discovery that radically overturned established notions about the history of these legendary Scandinavian seafarers. Yuri Peets, the expedition leader, uncovered one of the most impressive Viking burial sites ever known to experts. The remains of over 40 human skeletons, resting in 2 boat burials, were accidentally discovered in 2011 during road construction. We can confidently state that this was a battle burial and that a major battle undoubtedly occurred here, researchers assert. 40 bodies laid out in 2 ships. That says a lot. The battle must have been extremely fierce. We observe brutal wounds on the skeletons. Some, for example, have severed arms and skulls are fractured. It's clear that this was a heavy clash, and they had to hastily bury these victims. Tallinn researcher Raeli Altme dedicated herself to studying the bones of the Saaremaa warriors, seeking to unravel the mystery of their demise. All the skeletons, without exception, were undeniable signs of violent death and multiple combat wounds. The upper arm is cut into 4 pieces, with more than 4 cuts on the bone, Altme describes in detail. The position of the hand or upper arm could have been like that because some blows are in one direction, at one angle, and then the position changed. When the Tallinn team applied the most modern dating methods to the discovered skeletons, they were profoundly shocked by the results. Analysis of all discovered items, including the skeletons themselves and organic material, showed that they belonged to pre-Viking times. Incredibly, the ships and bodies date back at least 100 years before the first officially recorded Viking raid. Nevertheless, the weapons, the characteristic shape of the ships, and other artifacts buried with the remains undeniably prove that the men found in the 2 boat burials came from Scandinavia. These 40 bodies serve as convincing evidence that Vikings conducted their raids at least a century earlier than scholars previously assumed. It can now be confidently asserted that these individuals were Scandinavian seafarers who somehow met their tragic end on Saaremaa. The Viking Age, as further research will reveal, was a time of unprecedented brutality, and the fierce battle that raged on Somme Beach must have been exceptionally large-scale if 40 warriors were hacked to pieces and then respectfully buried by their comrades. I think during the battle he fell, and he was attacked from behind, an expert muses while examining the remains. Perhaps he fell, he was probably fighting because the cuts are on his right upper arm. But, in my opinion, this upper arm, the hand, was somehow fixed, because you can't make blows so that they are at the same angle, more or less. And finally, I found one of the foot bones, which also means that he must have been lying down or something, because the blow landed somewhere here. And, of course, the final act was this decapitation, in my opinion. Archaeological data discovered in Russia confirm that Vikings not only raided, but also actively traded along the great rivers of Eastern Europe, at least from the mid-8th century. Adrian Saline, a distinguished researcher of early Russian history from St. Petersburg University, notes, "No one knew what was in ancient Rus. Everyone was aware that somewhere around the Caspian Sea, silver coins were minted, and that they could be exported to the rest of Europe in unimaginable quantities. And it was this vast area between the Baltic and Caspian Seas, along the Great Volga River, that was first colonized by Scandinavians. Here, in Staraya Ladoga, on the picturesque banks of the Fokhof River, dendrochronological dating of wooden artifacts, such as this stick with carved Viking alphabet letters called runes, convincingly shows that Scandinavian traders and warriors appeared in these lands long before any mention of Vikings in known written chronicles. As for Staraya Ladoga, Scandinavian artifacts dating to the pre-Viking era have been discovered in the oldest layers of all excavation sites in the Staraya Ladoga area, testifying to their early and significant presence. Ancient chronicles, known as sagas, and runic inscriptions carved on the stones of Scandinavia eventually gave a name to these people whose grand exploits remained unrecorded for many centuries before they carved their way into history books. These were the Vikings. They were men and women who fearlessly left the safety of their homes to explore and plunder distant lands, from modern-day Poland, Ukraine, and Russia to the remote islands of the North Atlantic and even, as the latest discoveries show, to the shores of America. Vikings spread not only dread and terror but also a complex, extensive trade network, forever changing the face of the world. The mystery of the Vikings' origins and the motives behind their audacious raids now seems to be revealed. Scandinavian warriors began their raiding expeditions along the coast of the Baltic Sea and the Atlantic Ocean as early as the early 7th century. By the end of the 8th century, they had firmly established themselves in the northernmost British Isles, mercilessly ravaging Scotland and dispossessing the indigenous Pictish population, whose mysterious monuments still stand tall in the Orkney Islands. I'm sure that initially, people came here to trade, and that would have been the first contact. And the first contact would certainly have been at that level, and they would have been finding out what Shetland was all about as a result of that. However, objects appear in Pictish context showing such a connection. How aggressive or not aggressive it became, we don't actually know, researchers note. Here, at Jarlshof in the Shetland Islands, it is clearly visible how Vikings repurposed and reused Pictish dwellings. The fate of the local inhabitants, however, remains unsolved. Sometime in the 8th century, warriors from Norway arrived in these lands, and from that moment, Pictish culture irrevocably disappeared. The term Viking really only refers to the very first settlers, who were in an initial, exploratory, perhaps raiding phase, which in Shetland may have only lasted a generation. I don't think it's as black and white as you were either a raider and a pirate or you were a farmer and had your own industry, like the soapstone industry or whatever you were doing. I'm sure all of those roles were mixed, and it's not as clear-cut as that, experts add. The Vikings likely employed hit-and-run tactics for decades in their raids on coastal and riverine settlements in Scotland and Ireland before launching an attack on a monastery in northern England, where they discovered untold treasures beyond their expectations. However, their arrival was not limited to a mere thirst for plunder. At that time, a titanic struggle unfolded, pitting Charlemagne's Christian empire against Europe's last pagan peoples. The holy island of Lindisfarne, which is completely cut off from the mainland at high tide, today attracts numerous tourists eager to admire seabirds. In their time, monks chose this location precisely for its seclusion. On the horizon stood Bamburgh Castle, a Northumbrian stronghold, close enough for the Holy Fathers to exert religious influence and receive protection. No one could have foreseen the brutal attack that occurred on June 8, 793. The chronicler Alcuin of York bitterly commented on the event. Lo, the church of St. Cuthbert, spattered with the blood of the priest of God, despoiled of all its adornments, a place more venerable than all in Britain, given over to plunder to pagan peoples. However, Alcuin of York himself was far away at the time, in Aachen, the capital of Europe's greatest empire, ruled by Charlemagne, proclaimed the defender of Christianity. Charlemagne's northward expansion and the 30-year forced conversion of the Saxons to Christianity brought his empire to the very borders of pagan Denmark. It is not surprising that Christian chroniclers were sworn enemies of the pagan Vikings. But, according to Marit Wieck, a leading archaeologist at the Royal Palace in Osberg, Norway, the pagans may have merely been reacting to Christian atrocities. At that time, Charlemagne was conquering territory after territory in Europe, and Charlemagne's minister of war was Alcuin. He, for example, had been to Lindisfarne Monastery. The first attack we know about was on Lindisfarne Monastery, so one theory is that the raid was a response to Charlemagne's aggression. Further developments showed that Viking raids gradually transformed into invasions when the political situation in both Scandinavia and the great kingdoms of Europe created favorable opportunities for attack. Raids were meticulously planned to strike at the moment of the enemy's greatest weakness and maximum potential for plunder. Charlemagne died in 815 AD, and just 30 years later, his grandsons plunged into civil war, pitting three Frankish armies against each other. The opportunity to attack and plunder in the very heart of the empire was too great to miss. The great river Seine flows into the English Channel and runs directly to Paris. In 841, the Danish Viking Age sailed up it with 13 ships and fewer than 1,000 men, mercilessly burning the city of Rouen. He continued upriver to the magnificent Jumièges Abbey, where he ransomed the monks. The Vikings remained for the winter, ravaging the countryside the following year. In 845, the city of Paris itself was plundered by a certain Ragnar. Viking raids continued for the next 30 years. Vikings sought to avoid direct battles with the Franks, but more often, they were paid either to leave or to fight each other, or to serve as mercenaries. They were also granted lands in the northern Netherlands and at the mouth of the Rhine in exchange for their military services. We cannot ignore the shock and the violence, but neither can we see relations between Scandinavians, Franks, and other peoples as only that. There were other kinds of relationships, including trade relations, and also relations like discussions, negotiations, exchanges, researchers emphasize. When the Vikings encountered serious resistance in Francia, they turned their gaze to England, which at the time was little more than a patchwork of weak kingdoms. Bamborough served as the residence of one of the Northumbrian kings, and Northumbria itself was just one of 4 kingdoms in England during that period. Northumbria stretched from the Scottish border to the River Humber, south of York. It was divided into 2 sub-kingdoms constantly warring with each other, while central England was occupied by Mercia. The kingdoms of East Anglia and Wessex occupied the east and west of the country, respectively. Divided and mutually hostile, they could not offer adequate resistance to what was initially little more than a Viking nuisance. The warriors of the English kingdoms, whose military actions were often sporadic, proved completely incapable of withstanding the indomitable ferocity of the Viking conquerors. In 865, an imposing force known as the Great Heathen Army, led by 4 prominent chieftains, Ivar, Halfdan, Ubba, and Guthrum, landed on the coast of East Anglia, initiating a 20-year period of profound terror and destruction. Their campaign was marked by the swift capture of York on All Saints' Day, while both rival kings of Northumbria were engrossed in celebrating the Christian holiday. The invaders subjected one of these monarchs to the agonizing torture known as the Blood Eagle, while the other fell in battle. After these brutal acts, the Viking army moved on, aiming to subdue the rest of England. As a result, York transformed into a vital Viking capital, maintaining this status for an entire century. However, the narratives presented in historical textbooks are not always fully corroborated by archaeological discoveries. As Peter Connolly, director of excavations in the Hungate area, explains, we talk about the archaeology of York as being Anglo-Scandinavian. So you've got an Anglo-Saxon aspect and a Scandinavian aspect, and it's very difficult to separate those. So it already looks like we're dealing with a more cosmopolitan population than, say, the historical records would lead us to believe. This observation points to a more complex intermingling of cultures than purely textual sources might suggest. The Jorvik Center, located at Coppergate in York, serves as a repository for significant artifacts of Scandinavian origin, among which exquisitely crafted combs, often considered the quintessential male adornment of the era, are particularly notable. Nevertheless, archaeological investigations have also unearthed a Saxon helmet retrieved from a well and planks from a Saxon ship that were repurposed as structural wall elements in a Viking warehouse in the Hungate area, further underscoring the deep interpenetration of these 2 distinct cultures. After Ivar unleashed his terror across the northern lands of England, his forces captured Repton, a place of significant religious and political importance in Mercia. Today, the pond behind Repton School and beneath the churchyard is a tangible remnant of a dock on the River Trent that once served a Viking stronghold. It was here, in the churchyard, that a remarkable discovery was made. 250 skeletons, predominantly male, were carefully arranged around a central grave. This burial dates to 873, established by a found Saxon coin, a coincidence, as this was the year of Ivar's death. Nearby, at Heathwood, hundreds of small mounds indicate the existence of an extensive Viking military cemetery, a silent testament to their formidable presence. In the same momentous year, another prominent Viking chieftain, Halfdan, launched a raid on Scotland. However, instead of merely plundering, he strategically left a portion of his warriors with the explicit purpose of establishing farms. This act clearly demonstrated that the Vikings came not just for loot, but for permanent settlement. Nevertheless, contrary to often exaggerated accounts written by Christian chroniclers of the period, the actual demographic impact of this influx on England's relatively small indigenous population appears to have been comparatively negligible. We're not talking about a massive population in the hundreds of thousands, say, for the north of England and Scotland, but I'd be very surprised if anyone estimated it above 1 million. This indicates that the scale of Viking settlement, though significant, did not imply an overwhelming numerical superiority that would drastically alter the existing demographic landscape. King Alfred of Wessex, whose kingdom remained the sole Anglo-Saxon entity to withstand the relentless Scandinavian onslaught, achieved a decisive victory, routing the second invading Viking army at Ashdown. Despite this triumph, military campaigns continued for nearly 2 decades, during which the Vikings often relied on vital support from Ireland, where Ivar's sons had firmly established themselves. The Great Heathen Army pursued its campaigns with relentless determination, achieving near-complete success until its last surviving leader, Guthrum, was finally defeated by Alfred in 878. This defeat led to the signing of a treaty, which included Guthrum's baptism. A vast area of England, subsequently known as the Danelaw, was allotted for Viking governance from their stronghold in York. Nevertheless, this fragile peace proved short-lived, as additional Viking contingents from Francia and Ireland soon joined the ongoing conflict in subsequent years. As history would show, events occurring in Norway and Denmark continued to profoundly influence the character and intensity of these persistent raids. In response to the incessant invasions, Alfred initiated a series of comprehensive military reforms that significantly strengthened Wessex's ability to resist the raiders. He effectively created England's first standing army, a revolutionary concept for the time, and simultaneously oversaw the construction of a network of fortified towns, strategically known as Bus. These strongholds provided vital refuge for the rural population during periods of attack. Moreover, the increased administrative efficiency implemented throughout England played a crucial role in securing the unwavering loyalty of the local populace. Numerous views on Anglo-Saxon England are explained by its well-developed taxation system, and there are ways of extracting people from the land, and that's obviously linked to the fact that you get a trickle-down effect from the central authority. Let's call it the king, to before the land is distributed, and that beneficence buys loyalty. This illustrates how a sophisticated taxation system and a centralized method of land distribution created a powerful mechanism for securing allegiance, effectively spreading authority and benefaction downwards from the monarch. Scotland also continued to suffer relentless attacks from Viking contingents. In 871, Ivar reinforced his forces by joining a Viking army from Ireland, leading to a successful campaign to capture Dumbarton Castle, an isolated British settlement located deep in the heart of Pictish Scotland. The unfortunate inhabitants of this fortress were subsequently enslaved and forcibly transported to Ireland. On Scotland's east coast, Vikings also attacked Dunatar Castle in 900, a site located just across the border from Northumbria. In this clash, the Pictish king Domnall was killed. Even after the formidable Great Heathen Army disbanded and its immediate threat diminished, invasions led by other Viking chieftains, particularly from Scotland and Ireland, persisted. This incessant activity contributed to the emergence of new political entities, such as the new Kingdom of Strathclyde, renowned for its distinctive stone carving, and also stimulated the development of nascent schools in faraway Denmark and Norway, indicating a broader cultural influence. The relentless territorial expansion undertaken by emerging ruling dynasties in Scandinavia often forced those nobles who refused to submit to seek their fortunes abroad. The more significant and profitable the plunder became, the greater the investment made in building imposing ships and assembling larger contingents of warriors, enabling increasingly ambitious and destructive attacks. In Norway, each valley traditionally had its own monarch, a fragmented political landscape that persisted until a powerful ruler, controlling a strategic strait along the Norwegian coast, used his considerable financial might to subdue these disparate lords. Thus, in 870, Harald Fairhair embarked on the ambitious endeavor of unifying the First Kingdom of Norway, beginning his efforts for Morns on the island of Kamøy. It is certain that Harald Fairhair's primary royal domains were concentrated in Rogaland and Hålogaland. Although other territories were administered on his behalf, his absolute authority extended only to these two specific counties. Ultimately, the profound political and social transformations occurring in the heart of the Viking lands directly influenced the scale and trajectory of their far-reaching raids, both to the east and to the west. The Viking push into England and the Frankish lands was driven by both complex political reasons and an insatiable thirst for plunder. Harold's opponents, those who saw no benefit in paying him tribute and serving in his army, might instead have dedicated themselves to raiding and exploring the vastness of the North Atlantic. Hundreds of fjords served as ideal refuges, and the devastation of the rich coast of England and the Frankish Empire, as well as voyages to Iceland, undoubtedly seemed more appealing pursuits than submitting to this ambitious Danish chieftain. Many Vikings served as mercenaries for warring Frankish kings and were even invited to occupy Frisia, which opened the way for further attacks along the continental coast. They returned home not only with valuable spoils but also with increased ambitions to rule as full-fledged kings in their own lands. In 947, political events unfolding in Norway triggered significant upheaval in England. Harold Fairhair's son, Eric Bloodaxe, having been defeated by his English-educated brother, found refuge among the Scandinavians of York. The nobility of Northumbria rebelled against their new Saxon king, Eadred, and elected Eric as king in his place at Ripon Cathedral. Eadred responded with ruthless determination, ordering the cathedral burned, thereby forcing the rebellious nobility to surrender. The Norwegian Viking was killed in battle after a second attempt to seize the throne. It should be remembered that Eric Bloodaxe was finally ousted as king of this region in 954, and from approximately 960 to the 970s, a whole new complex of development is observed in Hungate. The Hungate area, located in Jorvik, now truly expands beyond its previous limits, and this process continues right up to the 11th century. It is necessary to consider how Scandinavian societies developed. They themselves were the result of interaction with external cultures, yet this is also a subject of active debate, as it is impossible to imagine that all stimuli for their evolution came exclusively from outside, as already noted. Internal changes also played a key role in the development of Scandinavian society. Swedish raiders held a dominant position in the Baltic Sea, extending their influence from Lake Mälaren to the islands of Gotland and Öland. These two large islands, with their extensive coastlines, served as ideal bases for raids into Central and Eastern Europe, as well as important transit points for the trading centers of Hedeby and Birka. The trading towns teemed with goods captured from the plains of Eastern Europe and plundered from the cities of the West. A significant amount of treasure discovered on the islands of Öland and Gotland, and now exhibited in the Stockholm Museum, clearly demonstrates how profitable both trade and plunder were, and how from the earliest times, Vikings sought the most transportable valuables available in that era: bronze, silver, and gold. They traded or plundered furs, walrus ivory, amber, and slaves. Vikings conducted their raids and commercial activities along the rivers of Central and Eastern Europe for centuries before their first attack was recorded in the West. It is widely believed today that the Vikings' arrival in Eastern Europe was driven by their interest in silver, dating back to the 9th century. Between 800 and 900 AD, several million silver dirhams were exported from the Caspian Sea region. There was no clear distinction between raiders and traders. One day they would devastate estates and churches, and the next they would sell the same goods in markets. One such trader was a Norwegian seafarer named Othere, who recounted to King Alfred of England the characteristics of the trade routes used by Viking explorers and warriors. He described a journey to the northernmost part of Norway, around into the Arctic Ocean and back, to acquire walrus tusks and seal hides. He also described the trading town of Koppang in Norway and the trade routes into the Baltic Sea. Another explorer, Wulfstan of Hedeby, provided information about places where Vikings exchanged their goods for similar riches. Wulfstan's voyages demonstrate the colossal scale of the Viking trade network between West and East. Among the places Wulfstan visited was the great city of Trousseau, whose ruins Michael Jagosinski discovered 20 years ago while cycling home. As mentioned, Trousseau was founded by Scandinavian settlers on the border with Baltic peoples and Slavs. Objects found in Trousseau are mainly Scandinavian, but there are also ceramic items, specifically clay pots, produced by West Slavs, as well as pots made by Baltic peoples, particularly the Prussians. Viking chieftains established their dominance in this Baltic trading post, transforming it into a strategic military base to supply traders and warriors on their expeditions deep into Eastern and Southern Europe. Besides everyday items, Michael Jagosinski discovered a significant number of swords. Trousseau was a key hub in the Viking network of trade and plunder. In light of this data, one can observe a phenomenon resembling early globalization. Identical artifacts, Arab coins, and weights are found everywhere, from Britain to northern Rus. Thus, a unique unified space was formed, and this unification stimulated the flourishing of trade and crafts. Here in Trousseau, local artisans processed amber and made combs, swords, jewelry, tools, and weights. Slaves were employed in both production processes and port work. Once vast and prosperous, trade centers stretched along the entire Baltic coast, from modern-day Rostock to the Neva River, where St. Petersburg now stands. The Slavic peoples inhabiting this vast territory led a simple village life, practicing slash-and-burn agriculture. They submitted without much resistance to the predatory Vikings. It is widely believed that a significant portion of the goods exported from Eastern Europe to the Caspian Sea via Scandinavians consisted of slaves. There are even claims that in the 10th century, Arab markets were literally flooded with slaves from Eastern Europe. Vikings, in turn, transformed their military outposts into bustling trading towns where merchants paid them for protection. Thus, the Scandinavians actively established new trade routes between East and West. In 841 AD, while Normans devastated Rouen in France, the Scandinavian warrior Rurik and his two brothers founded the Novgorod Principality. They were invited by the Slavic tribes of modern-day Russia, seeking peace and protection. Archaeological findings at Rurikovo Gorodish, located just upstream from Novgorod, strongly attest to a significant Scandinavian presence. Viking artifacts discovered in the Novgorod region are linked to both trade and military activities. Scandinavian burials contain not only weapons but also scales and silver, suggesting the buried individual was a merchant. The impressive rivers and lakes of northern Rus served as the heart of early Viking conquests. Lake Ladoga remains an important navigable artery, into which the Fokhof River flows, originating from Lake Ilmen, located 200 kilometers to the south. The Svir River in northern Russia is one of the waterways that still connects the Caspian and Baltic seas. Weapons such as axes and swords found in Novgorod and Staraya Ladoga indicate that these places were not only prosperous trade centers but also important military bases. However, it should be noted that very few Scandinavian weapons have been found in the Novgorod region, while items related to trade and daily life are abundant. It is also important to mention that Russia is crisscrossed by numerous rivers, and movement primarily occurred via waterways, and Scandinavians were predominantly traders. Just 50 years after the first recorded raid on Lindisfarne, Vikings penetrated the river system of Eastern Europe, reaching the Black Sea itself. Rurik's successor, Oleg, moved his headquarters down the Dnieper River and successfully captured the city of Kiev. In 907, he took Constantinople, and in 911, he concluded a trade treaty, guiding his ships past the city's sea fortifications. In the same year, Vikings were granted Normandy as their new home in France. Oleg secured an advantageous trade deal with the Byzantine Empire, transforming Kiev into the capital of a great ruling dynasty. Part of this deal involved providing mercenaries to the emperor as his personal guard, known as the Varangian Guard. By this time, half of England and much of France were already under Viking rule, yet their raids did not cease. Iceland is located halfway across the North Atlantic, the most dangerous sea for Vikings, and yet, whether by accident or design, Scandinavians landed there as early as 840 AD. Later, political upheaval in their homeland led to an exodus of refugees opposing the rule of Harald Farir. The Vikings who left Norway for Iceland found a completely pristine land and brought their social structures with them. The owners of the largest farms also served as the community's high priests and were called Gwa. 40 Gwa annually held the Althing, or parliament, at the Lal Rock. Here, more than anywhere else, the early Viking way of life was preserved. From here, Viking ships sailed west to Greenland, where 2 settlements were established. From there, they traveled all the way to the American continent for the first time around 1000 AD. Voyages to the land known as Vinland were recorded by a monk who sailed with the explorer Leif Erikson. The sagas recount Viking expeditions to America, detailing them in saga literature. It should be assumed that there were far more expeditions than described in the sagas. Traces of Viking settlements in America have also been found, and there are stories from Native Americans about these blue-eyed people they encountered. Settlements on the American continent lasted only a few years, while the Little Ice Age from the 13th century led to the decline of the Greenlandic settlements as well. In Europe, the brutal Viking Age was reaching its climax. Viking invaders instilled terror even more than a century after the Great Raids. The first millennium AD was a time of widespread violence. In 2012, 18 skeletons were found on the grounds of St. John's College in Oxford. Scientists immediately linked the discovery to the St. Brice's Day massacre of 1002, when the King of England ordered the killing of all Danes in his kingdom. The task of identifying these individuals fell to Mark Pollard from forensic archaeology. He explained, "We first radiocarbon dated some of them, and for various reasons the radiocarbon age didn't quite match what we expected, 1002 AD, but there are reasons why that might be. Then we started looking at carbon and nitrogen isotopes in bone collagen, which is an indicator of diet, and we also looked at strontium and oxygen isotopes in tooth enamel, because that gives some indication of where these people grew up." The fate of the remains discovered in Oxford proved similar to that of another group of skeletons found near the coastal town of Weymouth. Researchers wondered if they belonged to Vikings, and the answer was affirmative. Scientists compared these findings with already identified Viking remains from Weymouth. Radiocarbon dating showed that both groups were of roughly the same age. Furthermore, analysis of strontium and oxygen isotopes in the teeth of the skeletons revealed an identical pattern. These people did not originate from southern England. Their isotopic composition diagrams indicated a region with older geology and a colder climate consistent with Scandinavia. While strontium isotopic analysis indicated a non-local origin, possibly from the Danelaw, other signs even more convincingly hinted at their true identity. Several skeletons showed healed wounds consistent with blade injuries. This suggested that if a group of men aged 16 to 25 had such injuries, it was highly probable they had participated in combat previously. Thus, this was clearly not a random group of farmers. Rather, they were most likely professional warriors, mercenaries, or raiders. The early 11th century was characterized by widespread violence, and in that era, national identities often played a lesser role than local and family ties. Understanding what identity truly meant at that time is quite challenging. Modern researchers tend to use simplified categories such as Danes or Anglo-Saxons. However, this entire concept of identity was a kind of construct. When speaking of Danes, it could refer to people who came directly from Denmark or to second or third generations born in the British Isles but who retained Danish origins, customs, and perhaps even a style of dress distinct from the Anglo-Saxons. Precisely determining this is extremely difficult. Meanwhile, far to the north, in York, another victim of violence was discovered beneath the streets of Coppergate. This skeleton also bore multiple blade wounds, yet determining the exact cause of this young man's death proved virtually impossible. Researchers admit that the precise motives for the killing will forever remain unknown. Osteological data unequivocally indicated a violent death. However, connecting this specific event to any known historical episode is not possible. Nevertheless, this discovery serves as a grim reminder of a bloody and brutal end to someone's life, a common tragedy in that era. Although the legend of bloodthirsty Vikings is firmly entrenched in popular consciousness, the true nature of their society may differ significantly from what scholars have described for centuries. Archaeology demonstrates an astonishing ability to dismantle entrenched notions of isolation among Vikings, the Anglo-Saxon world, Picts, and Celts. On the contrary, research is beginning to blur these fuzzy boundaries, revealing a much more complex society where people could freely self-identify. Undoubtedly, conflicts over self-determination and power occurred, but at the same time, there was a significant influx of continental imports, and products from Britain were actively exported abroad. All of this, according to researchers, was woven into a single, rich tapestry of interconnections. Perhaps the most daring of all known expeditions departed from Sweden to the easternmost edge of the Viking world. Around 1040 AD, Ingvar the Far-Traveled, leading a small army of about 1,000 men, left central Sweden. Their path led through Rus and then towards modern-day Georgia, which was then under Arab influence, where they achieved a decisive victory. The lands ruled by the Saracens were known as Serkland. It is speculated that they may have crossed the Caspian Sea and even reached Tashkent, but only one of numerous ships returned home. The memory of the men who traveled with Ingvar is immortalized on 26 runestones found in Sweden. However, the most poignant of these is considered to be the one now standing on the grounds of Grip's home castle, on the shore of Lake Mälaren. It tells of Tola, who erected this stone in memory of her son Herir, Ingvar's brother. The stone states that they bravely traveled far for gold and in the east fed the eagle, dying in the south in Serkland. Ingvar was presumably of royal blood, and his family was among the leaders of an international Viking elite who continued to lead their warriors into battle even 250 years after the famous raid on Lindisfarne. The most common myth about Vikings portrays them as ruthless thieves, pirates, invincible warriors who always won battles, brave and fearless of death. However, the historical truth is that they were neither better nor worse than other peoples of that era. They lived in an extremely brutal time, and their actions reflected the general atmosphere of the period. The year 1000 became a turning point in Viking history. The era of early, scattered raids came to an end, and Viking expansion reached its peak. But this also marked the beginning of a century characterized by even greater bloodshed. The free-spirited, independent Viking chieftains were replaced by powerful Viking lords, kings of entire countries. It was they who unleashed the full might of vast Viking armies on England and on each other, shedding far more blood than in all the preceding centuries. Across the vast expanses of Eastern and Western Europe, well-resourced and highly skilled mercenary forces held a prominent position. Their insightful commanders, demonstrating exceptional adaptability, not only waged battles but also actively adopted the art of state governance from their adversaries whom they encountered on the battlefield. This very ability to learn and think strategically allowed them to lay the foundation for state formations, many of which retain their outlines and basic principles of operation